Good afternoon, everybody. David Sutphen, Chief Strategy Engagement Officer at 2U. Thrilled to have you join me and my special guest, Dean Sandra, Dr. and Dean Sandra Crewe, for the 8th episode of EDU Live. For those of you who've joined us in the past for these conversations, I feel very blessed to have just an amazing group of guests who come each month to have conversations with me about issues of access, equity, and opportunity in higher ed. And Dean Crewe couldn't be a more apt guest for that conversation today. So I welcome her to this conversation. Hope you're having a good week so far, Dean Crewe, and thank you for joining me. Let's just dive right in, because we had a chance to spend some time together last week. And I actually wore a prop today. For those, I can't tell whether it's backwards for you guys to see this or not, but my sweatshirt says Trailblazer, and I think you'll understand why I wore this. So let's, Dean Crewe, let's start with the beginning. Last week when we had a chance to spend a little bit of time together, I asked you about where your kind of passion and purpose around inclusion came from, and you told me just a really compelling and I think powerful story about you as a high school student. So why don't we start there, give it a little bit of background on where you grew up and where you went to high school.
Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate this opportunity and thinking about my passion. It really does draw me back to the time in my life where I desegregated high school. When we think about equity and inclusion. At the age of 14, I made the grand decision that I would be a part of the desegregation movement in Halifax County, Virginia. And so during that time, as you can imagine, it was not because there was readiness for schools to be desegregated. It was the law of the land. So I was following the wave of the law, which meant separate but equal was replaced with freedom of choice in the county that I grew up in. And so using freedom of choice, I decided, I want to do something different, not something better, because I had the best education imaginable in all Black high schools. So they were phenomenal, but I decided, my sister and I, that we were going to try something different. You know how it is. You're 14 and 15, and my sister
Why not, right?
Were valedictorian and salutatorian, so I wanted to give another experience. But I desegregated high school and realized that for the first time that I truly was not welcome. I was there, but I was not welcome to be there. And so I started to understand what it felt like to be unwelcome. So I think my passion is around what would it feel like to make people welcome. And so as I desegregated high school and I was called all those horrific names of that time, I was fortunate in that I didn't internalize it. But I saw many of my fellow students who were demoralized by the things that were said about them, about the unfair grading practices. And, we often talk, there's a book, Why Do All the Blacks Sit Together in the Cafeteria?
Oh, yeah.
And what it reminded me of, it wasn't that we were sitting together in the cafeteria, is that no one was sitting with us in the cafeteria. So that sort of passion about being abused, emotionally abused as a child, and not being able to sort of defend for myself. And, at that age, I made the decision to go. So it wasn't like I could go home and complain to my parents that, hey, this isn't the right thing for me. But my success in that environment made me understand that you need a champion there with you. And my dad said to me, as I think about it, he said, I was complaining like all the other youngsters. Oh, this school is so hard. We can't make it here at the school. And my dad said, Sandra, you're not having such a hard time. Your grades are good. You're still an honor roll student. So why are you following the crowd and talking about the difficulty of it rather than helping the others to get through it? So, so that I think really is the genesis of my passion to see what happens if you don't do this. There are losses that we can never recoup. I don't know what they would have been in life had they been given an opportunity. My colleagues who were students then.
Yeah, very powerful. And, you know, I think often about, so my parents met in the early 1960s. My father's Black, my mother's white and Jewish, and it was a felony for a Black person to marry a white person at that time. So they had to go across state lines and get married, you know, at the justice of the peace over the lunch hour. And I think sometimes people lose sight of the fact that, like, you know, there are many people who have lived these experiences, right, of what it's like to be the other and to break these barriers. And so I often think it's important to remind people that, you know, these things are very present in as we grapple with some of the more immediate challenges of the day. And the other thing I was struck by, you know, because obviously in the last year in particular, year and a half, there's been a lot of discussion in our country about race and you know, inequities, and, you know, some people have called it another racial reckoning. And I was struck by one of the things that you said, which is that, you know, for me and at Howard, in our university and in our social work program, Black lives have always mattered. So why don't you talk a little bit about just your perspective around, which I think is a natural outgrowth of what you said about, you know, your high school experience, about when an approach to, you know, inclusion and equity and diversity is kind of embedded in just how you approach things. How do you show up in a conversation like the one we're having in society these days?
Well, you know, as again, I make the statement, and I could broaden the Black lives have always mattered to social justice has always mattered at Howard. So when we kind of think about social justice, we think of it in an evolutionary way, and that we've been fighting for social justice from our very beginning. So as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's sometimes hard for us because it's organic for us. I'm at Howard, I'm always looking to see who's not at the table. You know, I don't need a plan to tell me to do that. Doesn't have to be a task force to do that. It is so organic in me, is that when I'm a faculty and I'm looking at my faculty, I'm asking the question, whose voice am I not hearing? Because I'm going back to that moment in childhood when my voice was not welcomed. So it wasn't heard, not because I didn't want to say something, but when you feel that you are not welcomed at the table, your voice isn't heard. So at Howard, we have always said, we are welcoming every voice, even the voices that we disagree with. We welcome that voice at the table. So when we begin to think about social justice and Howard, we're really always looking at our legacy, but realizing that the work is unfinished. So it is not so much standing on the shoulders of those who paved the way for me. It's standing on their shoulders and realizing that somebody is standing on my shoulders today. So it's the evolution of the responsibility for social justice. So it's not, we are responsible. If it doesn't exist, then we're part of the problem unless we claim being part of the solution. So when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, by the way, colleagues, I had no idea what it meant. Because
you're like,
it was
what is this acronym I keep hearing?
Yeah, someone called me and said, hey, Dean, can you present on DEI? And I said, I'd love to if I knew what it was. You know, and then when they said it, I said, oh, that's the life I live. That's the life that I have lived. And again, we are always looking for the voice that's not there and how to, you know, be able to have them to lean into the conversation and not be at the table without a voice, because that is also possible when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can be at the table and not have a voice. So it's not just the look of equity. It is the voice of my experience and your parents' experience. That's what diversity, equity, and inclusion means for us at Howard. Hearing the story, hearing what's not being said.
Right. As much as what is being said. That's
Yes.
very powerful. So I see the I think it's a book behind you that says Social Workers for Social Justice. You know, obviously, as you said, there's a lot of different ways to live your life to have a positive impact on social justice. And maybe tell me a little bit more, just going back to your professional path. Um, at what stage did you know that social work was the path that you wanted to take? And have you always thought of it as a path to pursue social justice? Or and so talk a little bit about just your kind of career, because you're now obviously the dean of one of the most influential schools in the country, and creating these pathways for other students. And I want to talk a little bit more in the rest of the conversation about your approach to creating those pathways for your students.
Well, the sign behind me is actually a protest sign. I was in the march in August, promoting voting and those kind of things. So that is one of my protest signs that I was holding up for the crowd, is that,
Right on.
social workers are involved in social justice. But no, I didn't always want to be a social worker, because I didn't know what a social worker was in rural America. That had no meaning to me of what a social worker was. So I started my educational journey wanting to be a sociologist. Well, really, even before that, my brother was studying engineering here at Howard, and I wanted to be an engineer. But the pathway wasn't as clear for women
Right.
in engineering. So I went with my older sister to Virginia Tech, and I majored in sociology. Well, I wasn't fulfilled with sociology because I really wanted to touch that student in the classroom. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want just to know about the theory of racism and segregation and what made people thrive and survive. I wanted to be a part of the solution. So I was one of those who wanted to reach out and touch.
Yep.
And so I eventually changed my major, and I went to Catholic University. And so I was able to have a baccalaureate degree in social work. So that's what the transition and the transformation looked like. Understanding sociology was important. And for those of you who know, E. Franklin Frazier, one of our founding members of the School of Social Work, was both a sociologist and a social worker. So I understood the connection of those two. But I was more on the side of sitting down, listening, helping to pave a new way. So I decided that becoming a social worker, a macro social worker, by the way, meaning that I don't want just to look at the individual hurts and pains, but I want to look at systemic injustices. How do we change the way that the systems have made you think about this? We're thinking a lot about critical race theory. So, I mean, that sort of is a part of the conversation, is that when I was a director of a housing authority,
Mm-hmm.
it was easy to simply say, well, this is the pathology. But what I saw was the strengths, and that the system wasn't making it fair for some people. And so I became very focused on systematic changes and changing the system so it was more inclusive. So, simple things like older people being able to have pets in their
Mm-hmm.
apartment complexes. You may not think of it as a social justice issue, but it could be if other communities could have it. And just because you're in public housing, you don't get access to that. Or your children have to go to an inferior school system because of where your housing is located. So
Yep.
I started my focus on how can I work with housing in a way that it changes the trajectory of people, not just the individual that I am working with.
Great. And let's talk a little bit about your approach to your students, because one of the things you also said to me when we spoke was, and I think it picks back up on a theme that you had on earlier, which is, you want kind of all perspectives at the table, but you also, want to make sure that people can kind of see a path for them, and that not a lot of people know immediately what it means to be a social worker. So talk a little bit about just your approach as students come into the program who instinctively may think, hey, I think I might want to be a social worker, and maybe just for the audience, talk a little bit about just the breadth and diversity of the kinds of things that students who come out of, both your undergraduate and graduate programs do, and how they are kind of applying that in the real world, whether it's on a one-on-one basis or in systematic ways.
I think, very often individuals will come, or students will come with a notion of kind of what they want to do. But the notion of what they want to do is based upon what they've been exposed to. So I really start with their strengths. Tell me what you're good at. Tell me the things that you think you want to accomplish. And so I start working with them to realize their strengths, starting with the strengths, because no student comes to me as an empty slate. They come with a set of strengths. So I really try to tap into that. But I also try to say, you might want to consider this. You may be a social worker who's working with the media. You may be a social worker who's really working with residents in public housing. You may be the social worker who's evaluating public policy. So really expanding their horizons. Not very often you'll hear in social work, people are saying, well, those are the individuals who work with child welfare. And I say, yes, that's who we are. But guess what? Those are highly skilled social workers. There is nothing that you should ever say that's negative about that group of people. But that's one of our strengths, that we can work in stabilizing families. But we do that and more. So that is not all that we do. It's an important part of what we do, but we also make sure that there is housing for the family. We also make sure that that person, that when you're older, you're not socially isolated. We're going through a pandemic now, but social isolation is a huge issue within the community, or substance use and abuse. So really trying to help them to understand the needs of society. And it's not just serving lower socioeconomic individuals. The opioid use disorder, that's not necessarily about lower socioeconomic individuals. It's about dealing with substance use and helping families address that. So you may want to be a family therapist, and that's wonderful. That's great, but you also may want to be that entrepreneur who opens a group treatment center. So, showing them that their skill sets are needed and they have opportunities and they can make life different for other people, but not saying that, here, this is what we offer, you fit into what we offer. That is not my approach. My approach is to find out what you need and see how I can fit that into what we're offering you.
It's funny. It reminds me a little bit, not funny, but it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of, I'm a lawyer by training, and, certain people come into law school with like, I want to be this kind of, and once you get there, you realize that it's really a way of helping you think about how you solve complex problems and, what impact you want to have in the world. And you can be a lawyer in a lot of different contexts. You can be a policy person, you can be a litigator, you can be, a public defender. There's so many different ways. So it's really more about like, what impact do you want to have on the world? And then let's figure out how to set you on a trajectory that'll enable you to do what you want to do. So I guess in that regard, let's just talk a little bit about this moment and the need for social workers. I was, in preparation for this conversation, doing a little bit of, background research just on the huge societal need, the shortage of social workers. There was a recent article about the fact that like the New York City public school system just went and hired a bunch of social workers to come into the school system, presumably to address some of the issues that you've mentioned and dealing with COVID and the complexities and the impact on families. And it's resulted in a shortage of social workers in a lot of the clinics around the city. So just talk about why in this moment, solving this problem in terms of educating a new generation of social workers and increasing the number of people who choose that as a career is so critical to what we're trying to accomplish as a society.
It's always been critical, but I think, as you said, the spotlight has been shone. We see it more as we're looking at the problems that social workers tackle. It's not just with one segment of the population. because the pandemic really helped to show that more, because we all were impacted. We all had to stay home. Our mental health, some people had their mental health impacted by that. So social workers have provided 80% of the mental health counseling for a long time.
Long time.
But now what they're telling me is the wait list is long. So if you can imagine that you are facing a crisis, or a member of your family is facing a crisis, and you're being told it's 2 months before someone can see you, or whether you are a veteran and you're dealing with PTSD and you can't get in at this moment to get help. Well, with the increase in suicide,
Mm-hmm.
help is needed now. It is not something we can wait list you for. So we need social workers who will be there now in this moment in time to help to navigate people to better help. Because I think very often we're accustomed to a society where we get on the wait list and we're seen. Crisis intervention is a part of what we do as social workers. And so we want to be responsive to what's happening at this moment in time as we look for structural changes out there. So the increase, it's related largely to change. When there's a change, people react differently to change. There are some people who felt, well, you know what, this pandemic, as horrible as it was with the loss of lives, may have given me a break from a routine that wasn't healthy for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was going to work, I was feeling discriminated against at work. And so I had some time at home to really think and reflect about who I want to be and what I want to be. But others lost employment. They lost loved ones during the pandemic. So their mental health, if there was a problem, it exploded during this particular time. So social workers are important in addressing these needs, because we're not looking at the problem as just isolated to one thing, the pandemic. We're
Right.
looking at a person maybe who had a fragile system already. And so the fragility of their system made it so that they weren't able to survive and thrive, because, you know, one paycheck that's changed is huge for some people. Other people, it means you go to your savings.
Right.
For
Yeah, but
some,
I think the average family in the United States has what, $500 of savings or something
that's
like
right.
that.
And the pandemic really kind of, you know, used part of that 500 up, if you think about it.
Undoubtedly.
So here, when a social worker looks at it, we're looking at the whole person, not just why are you feeling depression at this moment? What was going on in the household? And so we focus on biopsychosocial spiritual assessments. You know, where are your support systems? Did something change with your support systems? What were they there? What were they before pandemic? And what we'll find is some of them were so fragile, anything could happen. And now you're telling me that not only do I have to manage to work using technology that I may or may not have had before, I'm
Totally.
having to homeschool.
Right.
And so perhaps I had a child with ADA, you know, a disability. And so social workers are able to sort of connect you with the other resources that you need. So it's not just about healing yourself. It is really strengthening yourself to help others. So that's what we do as social workers. So I think that's why we are a critical part of the healthcare team. So that we're there saying, well, you know, you can tell me that I need to take the medication for my hypertension and all of that. But if my income is such that I'm doing a skip pill pattern, and that I don't have the resources, and I'm dealing with food insecurity, then I'm going to skip purchasing medication. So, but a social worker is there to say, you know what, you need all of that. So how can I help you get?
Close those gaps, fill in those.
Exactly.
Right. So I guess one thing I'm interested in your perspective on is, like almost every facet of society, the last 18 to 24 months has forced people to embrace, sometimes reluctantly, but out of necessity, online. Obviously 2U's been in the business of helping, universities bring the best of themselves online for 14 years. I guess my first question is, what was before the pandemic hit, were you bullish about virtual, not necessarily from a pedagogy perspective, but like an actual in the field, like people being able to do counseling, sessions with people over, how has the pandemic changed or shaped perceptions in the social work field about like serving clients virtually versus what it was before?
I think there were always been people like me that were out front with technology. And so even before the pandemic, we were offering online courses and we knew telehealth was effective. But they're the ones who were the holdout people who were saying, I really need to touch that person. I really need to have them across from the desk. I don't know so much about this telehealth kind of model. Remote experiences have made us realize that we can change the way we provide service and have success in doing that. Because that's the only option we had. And some of us are just that way. That's not negative,
Right.
nor is it possible if you're a trailblazer. It just means that I feel that I'm more effective as a social worker if you're sitting across that desk and I can really see what's going on in your home and those kind of things. So the reluctant technocrats that were out there really started to see that, oh, I can do more. I can teach online. I can reach out to someone online. And for some people, it's better. They started to see that, the client didn't have to worry about the transportation to get to where I am.
Right.
They didn't have to worry about, dropping someone off at school and picking someone. So for some people, the technology gave them greater access to the resources they needed to attach to wellness. And so I think some of us saw that. Others really, yearned for the time that they could reach out and touch, but they did understand that it was more than a stopgap measure.
Right.
It was a change in the way we perceive how we can deliver quality health, not just stopgap. We can do this in a quality manner. So I think that so the ones who are already on board, we're going, yes, I told you so.
You have the wind at your back now, right? Yes.
And the other ones are saying, you know what, there's something to this, and we can all learn from this.
The Trailblazer theme continues. So we're going to move to the Q&A section. So we got a few more minutes. And I guess the first question is, from a kind of a curriculum and just approach to pedagogy and education, like what are the things that you feel like the social work discipline needs to change or embrace now? Maybe that it wasn't doing before. It sounds like online is one of them, but just more broadly, even beyond that, are there things that you feel like need to change from a curricular approach to education perspective in the discipline?
We really have to take a closer look at the systemic injustices, and if we have been used as conduits of some of the racist structures that were there. So we need to take to say, you know what, this policy may be the law of the land, but is it the best way to achieve family self-sufficiency? Is there another way of doing it? So not simply just enforcing the policies, but looking to see if we can have a seat at the table to influence the shift in policy so that policies are more flexible based upon individuals' needs. So, rather than to help people returning citizens, let's see what we can do to make sure that we're stopping the bleeding, that the person isn't incarcerated in the beginning. So right. I think we all have to really sort of we have to reckon with our role in systemic injustice and really begin to say, I get it, but there's another way. And we can only do that through listening to those who are served by our system. So I think we really have to go back to some earlier days where we were really focused on working with our clients and not for our clients.
Mhm.
And that's a different thing. We're working together to change the things that are not allowing them the success that they need. And certainly, yes, we have to embrace technology when appropriate, because it's not always appropriate for some areas. But we also have to become entrepreneurs. We have to, so we've been doing all of those things, but I think we have to do more of it. Embrace interdisciplinarity.
Mhm.
That social work is not an island to itself. Here at Howard, as you know, we have all of the disciplines, but social work being a core part of the STEM area. Social work really, if you think about architecture, when you're building a house, it has to meet the needs of persons living with a disability. So
Right.
so I think we really have to do more of integrating what we do with other disciplines. So that's why we have joint degrees with the MBA. So if you want to run a nonprofit,
Right.
social work needs to understand that. If you public health crisis like pandemic, a joint degree for MPH, joint degree in terms of divinity. So we are now sort of thinking about how do
Goes
we
more
join
holistic. Right.
forces with fine arts, art therapy, all of the expressive therapies to help people get well. We think that that is the way to go now. To
Makes total sense. And I think interestingly, a broader trend I think you see across higher education, across a variety of disciplines, really realizing if you want to have systemic impact, you have to work beyond your vertical to really make that happen, and understand these complex issues from a lot of different perspectives. So the next question we've gotten is, how, obviously Howard is one of our most iconic HBCUs, just the Black perspective. And what does it mean to be a Howard educated social worker? Are there things about your approach to integrating the Black perspective and shaping empathy and effective social work that you feel like kind of define what the difference is, the value proposition, why someone would say, I want to go to Howard as opposed to any other school in the country?
I think all schools of social work focus on social justice because that's who we are as social justice champions. But at Howard, we have a guiding philosophy called the Black perspective, which means that you analyze everything through the lens of, are we affirming the individuals? Are we thinking about their strengths? Are we looking at the social justice impact of something? Are we focused on internationalization? How does the person who's migrated to the country feel about this? So everything we filter through the lens of the Black perspective, meaning that we're including everyone. We are certainly giving primacy to African Americans because of the historical oppression, but it is not leaving anyone out. Any oppressed populations who are marginalized, populations who have not gotten their full share of the strengths of this country. So when we think about the Black perspective, it is a unique lens that moves it simply away from just being culturally competent to
Gotcha.
being culturally engaged. What is it that I missed? Tell me, what did I miss? So the Black perspective, the principles were grown from our very origin when we talked about a socio-cultural perspective. And we moved through the evolution of Black power, and we realized that, the strengths is that we are looking and hearing what other people are saying, and everything goes through that lens. So almost every paper, a student is going to say, tell me how the Black perspective helps you to work more effectively with the community group or with the client. That is a part of the thinking.
Inherent part of the
It's
approach.
organic. We don't have a special course on cultural competence, a special course on diversity. It is in every course. If it's research, for example, and everyone takes a research course, we ask the question, well, who are the outliers? we talk about the outliers and you just throw them out when you're sort of looking at certain things, but is there
In
a
this
way
case,
that
you want to know why are
who
they
they
outliers?
are and
Yeah.
why are they outliers? So
Yeah.
that's a whole different lens. So from research to policy to direct practice, we're asking you the question. If you look at it through the lens of the Black perspective, do you see something different? And if the answer is yes, you do something different. If the answer is no, then you continue to do the good job with what you know.
That's great. So I got two final questions. One is a little bit of a follow-up to one of the things you mentioned earlier about the kind of interdisciplinary approach, which and it looks like it's coming from somebody at the DC Department of Human Services, which is maybe talk a little bit more about the how you're helping foster the entrepreneurship needs of social workers who are thinking about pursuing a career or a practice that would necessitate them, being an entrepreneur, which is a whole nother skill in and of itself, right? That,
Absolutely.
and they don't those things don't always naturally coexist, right? You have to cultivate those.
I mean, there are a couple ways that we do it. Certainly those who are interested in the joint MBA, MSW degree, that's one way. But we have an area of practice called community administration policy practice. And within that, that's sort of the macro lens. And that would prepare individuals to think about how they would what their business would be. So we have professors, for example, Professor Broyles, who would say, okay, now that's the business you can start, yourself, and connecting them with the Small Business Administration or connecting them with someone else on campus who has a similar interest or with an alum who's already done that. So if you think about social workers, many are private practitioners.
Right.
So we have faculty members who have their own practice. So they are introducing them to what it takes to have your own practice. So I think it's largely through having them connecting with them with opportunities for entrepreneurship here on the campus, or really finding ways that they can find someone to mentor them. And I don't want to leave out the agency-based education, where if we know that they're really interested in this, we will try to find them an agency where they're doing their practice internship with that can really help them to understand what it takes to have a spin-off business from them. So we really try to take that into consideration. And there's that great thing called an elective.
You still have those, right?
Yeah, we still have those. So we can say, you know what, there's a course over there that you really may want to be engaged in. But so we do all of those things, but we value social workers as entrepreneurs.
Great. So I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question, which is because we're obviously super excited about the partnership that we now have with the School of Social, but talk maybe just for a minute about why taking the master's program online is such an important part of, the future vision for what you see for the program and the school, and what you see in the value of our partnership. Like why do it with us?
As I said, I've been a proponent for online education for a long time, but I saw that Howard produces social workers, and we call them Howard prepared social workers, that had that added layer of social justice that they can go out and change the world and make it a better place. So I saw the partnership expanding our brand. It's like any brand. If it's doing well, you want to expand it. So I saw it as expanding the brand. I met someone on campus over the summer who was working with children from California, and he said, I want this Howard experience, but I can't relocate my family at this stage in my life. But I know that this experience would make me a better counselor. That's why I want the partnership and appreciate the partnership, because it allows us to bring the Howard brand to a broader and more diverse population. And we were not able to reach all of them before. So this allows us to do that.
That's great. And then I guess the last thing I would say, self-care, you hear a lot about that these
Yeah.
days. And so I guess my last question to you is whether it's somebody who's currently a social worker, somebody who's thinking about a career in social work, like what advice would you give to them if they're like, hey, I don't know if I have the ability to, tackle the complexities for myself that are associated with choosing this as a career path. Like what counsel and guidance would you give them?
Well, I think every social worker has to engage in self-care. And I didn't say selfish care. I said self-care because they are different. It's not all about you. It's
Hmm.
not all about you, but uh, you know, you have to make a decision that there's work-life integration and not balance, because I don't know that you ever balance this. You integrate it in what you're doing. So I would say to you, uh, it may be the area of social work that you're going to go in. If you are not a person who can deal with working with foster children who are taken from their parents, then that's not the area of social work you should go in. Perhaps you should be in the area of social work where you are creating housing opportunities for that person, or you're doing something. So I think it is often
Knowing
about
yourself.
how you choose to practice social work rather than to being in a mode, being in the mode that somebody else created for you. Self-defining your role as social work. So self-care is really about understanding your goodness of fit. It's not for everyone. But
Yeah.
I can assure you, social work is broad enough that you can find a niche. I was just meeting with one of our graduates from California yesterday, and he was saying that he linked his MSW with real estate.
Hmm.
So he's doing both. So as he does the clinical work, he also has a position where he really engages in being in real estate. So sometimes it's about finding an outlet to go with the other more intensive parts of the practice, or just finding your best fit.
That's great. That's a great place to end. So I think for everybody who's listened to this conversation, you know why my Trailblazer zip up was a good theme for this conversation. Obviously, Howard is very fortunate to have you as a leader. I can imagine how inspiring you are for all the current and former students, and we couldn't be more thrilled about what the partnership ahead lies for Howard and to you, and hopefully we can bring what has made this such an amazing program to many, many more people around the country and the world who can then have an impact in the communities that they live. So thank you, Dean Crewe. I hope you have a great rest of the week. And that's a wrap, everybody.